Hi students, I'll try in this educational video to technologically introduce the steel connections as simply and as clearly as possible. Okay, let's go. Well, first I'll introduce the concept of steel connections. So let's consider ground, and on this ground we have columns as vertical members of the considered steel frame. These columns should be connected to the ground using column base plate connections. Let's consider also primary beams as horizontal members of the considered steel frame. These primary beams should be connected to the columns using column beam connections. If we consider also that we have secondary beams as it is depicted in blue, these secondary beams should be connected to the primary beams using beam-beam connections. We consider also that we have a bracing as it is depicted in green. This bracing can be connected to the ground and the column using a gusset base plate connections, and it can be also connected to the column and the primary beam using a column beam brace connections. Now I'll talk about the classifications of steel connections, and as you noticed, I already classified the steel connections into column base plate connections, column beam connections, beam beam connections, gusset base plate connections, column beam brace connections, but there are two other more significant classifications, which are the classification of steel connections based on connecting medium. And when I talk about the connecting medium, I mean fasteners and fixtures. And also we have the classification based on internal forces transfer. And in my opinion, this is the most significant classification. Now I'll talk about the classification based on connecting medium. Based on this classification, the steel connections are classified into riveted connections, bolted connections, and welded connections. The welded connections are principally characterized by their simplicity. The bolted connections are principally characterized by their economical installation. And for the riveted connections, it's to note that since 1960s and 70s, the use of riveted connections was replaced by the use of bolted connections for several reasons, principally the low installation cost and the convenience of installation and maintenance in favor of the bolted connections. Now I'll talk about the classification based on internal forces transfer. So based on this classification, the steel connections are classified into shear connections, moment connections, and axial connections. The shear connections are intended to transfer shear force. The moment connections are intended to transfer bending moment and shear force, and the axial connections are intended to transfer axial forces. And in the next educational video, I will talk deeply about the technological solutions used to elaborate each type of steel connections based on this classification. That's all for this educational video. Please, if you have any remarks, suggestions, or questions, please mention it in the comments. Thank you very much for your attention.